The Black Cave Tragedy. In April 1995, Thomas Edward Benning, an adventure enthusiast, decided to explore Black Cave in Arizona. Thomas had explored the cave multiple times before and felt confident despite going alone this time. He carried only an electric miner's lamp, no helmet, and relied on his sense of direction. As he entered, the first chamber was wide and familiar, giving him a false sense of security. Instead of staying on the usual path, he took a side passage, drawn to the obscure, darker route. The narrow passage twisted deeper into the cave, with uneven rocks and low ceilings. Thomas crawled and climbed for over an hour, losing track of distance and direction. Eventually, he realized he was lost, unable to recognize any landmarks. He tried retracing his steps, but the cave's maze-like tunnels disoriented him further. His miner's lamp began to flicker, signaling his dire situation. Panic crept in as he fumbled to adjust the lamp, but moments later, it went out completely. Plunged into total darkness, Thomas couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. Desperately, he reached for a matchbook in his pocket and struck a match. The tiny flame cast faint light, revealing jagged walls around him. Hope flickered with the flame, but it was short-lived as the match burned out quickly. He continued striking matches one by one, using brief flashes of light to search for an exit. As the last match burned out, he was swallowed again by the oppressive darkness. Despite the fear, Thomas crawled forward, feeling along the walls with his hands. To avoid going in circles, he left small markers, his shoe insole, strips of clothing, and trash bag remnants. His movements slowed as exhaustion set in from dehydration, hunger, and sheer fatigue. Eventually, Thomas stumbled upon a narrow fissure, a crack in the rock that seemed like a possible escape route. Driven by fragile hope, he slowly lowered himself into the fissure, trying to find a foothold. As his hips passed through the narrowest part, he realized too late that he was stuck. He attempted to shift his weight, but the jagged rocks pressed tightly against his sides, wedging him in place. Thomas pushed with all his strength, but his weakened arms couldn't lift him back up. Panic surged as he thrashed, trying to free himself, but every movement wedged him deeper into the crevice. His legs were pinned, his body locked in place by the unyielding stone. He clawed at the rocks, leaving scratch marks as evidence of his desperate struggle. His breathing grew shallow, and his voice was too weak to carry beyond the narrow walls. Hours turned into days as Thomas faded in and out of consciousness, trapped and alone. Meanwhile, his wife grew concerned when he didn't return home and contacted the authorities. Search teams were deployed to caves Thomas had explored before, but none knew he'd chosen Black Cave. After days of searching, they finally found his car parked near the cave entrance. Rescue teams entered Black Cave, searching the main pathways but missing the obscure route Thomas had taken. They found his shirt and sunglasses near the entrance, but no other signs of him. Despite extensive searches, they failed to locate any traces deeper inside the cave. After weeks with no success, the official search was called off and Thomas was declared missing. His wife continued to plead with authorities, posting flyers and making public appeals for help. For over a year, the cave kept its secret, hiding Thomas deep within its dark passages. In December 1996, more than 20 months later, 3 cavers, Bill Graff, Elizabeth Robb, and Dale Green, entered Black Cave. They weren't searching for Thomas, just exploring the cave for a mapping project. Taking an unfamiliar route, they stumbled upon a burned matchbook lying in the dirt. Nearby, they found a broken miner's lamp and scattered matchsticks. Curious but unaware of the connection, they continued deeper into the cave. On their return, they decided to explore a narrow side tunnel where the clues had been found. As they crawled through the tight passage, Rob noticed a single shoe lying on the cave floor. Further in, they found a sock, followed by torn strips of fabric and personal items. Then they saw what looked like a bundle of fur. But as Rob approached, she realized the horrifying truth. It was the remains of Thomas Edward Benning, wedged in the narrow fissure where he had died. The group froze in shock, piecing together the tragic story through the scattered clues. Deep scratches on the rock walls told the silent story of Thomas's desperate attempts to escape. They documented the scene, taking photographs for identification and marking the location with reflective tape. Once back on the surface, they reported the discovery to the local sheriff. A recovery operation was organized days later, involving experienced cavers due to the tight spaces. After several challenging trips into the cave, they managed to retrieve Thomas's body. His wallet, still in his pocket, confirmed his identity after nearly 20 months of being lost. The discovery brought bittersweet closure to his wife, who had spent years searching for answers. Lost Creek System Tragedy. On August 9, 1980, Bruce Unger, Scott Trosson, Louise Hose, and Tom Strong prepared for an adventurous expedition into the Lost Creek Cave System in Colorado. Their goal was ambitious, a full through trip from the lower entrance to the upper exit, something no one had completed before. Bruce Unger, the most experienced caver in the group, had a history of navigating caves with high water flow. The team meticulously prepared, donning wetsuits to protect against the frigid cave waters. Unger and Trosson strapped seat harnesses over their wetsuits, emphasizing safety. They packed water waterproof gear, carbide lamps, and backup electric lights to ensure visibility in the cave's darkness. By 11:30 a.m., the group reached the cave entrance, eager to begin their exploration. Unger led the descent into the cave, with the sound of rushing water growing louder as they advanced. The team navigated narrow passages and tight boulder formations, testing their skills and patience. Approximately 150 feet into the cave, they encountered a major obstacle, a powerful water chute. The chute funneled water down a 2-foot-wide, 15-foot-long slope at a 30-degree angle, leading to a larger chamber. Unger bravely volunteered to climb the chute first, using friction holds to counter the strong current. As he neared the top, he warned the others of the slick conditions and advised caution. Suddenly, Unger lost his grip and was swept violently down the chute. His body hit the water forcefully, but he managed to wedge himself with his head and chest above water. However, his left foot became lodged in a crack, his bulky boot jammed tightly between the rocks. Unger shouted for help, panic evident in his voice. Louise Hose quickly scrambled up the chute to assist him while Trosson and Strong prepared below. Hose tried pulling Unger's leg, but his foot was firmly stuck. Unger struggled against the forceful current, exhaustion and panic setting in. Trosson and Strong climbed up to help, but the relentless water made it nearly impossible to maintain their positions. Hose lost her grip and was swept back down the chute, colliding with Trosson and Strong. Despite the chaos, Strong managed to keep his head above water while Trosson scrambled to grab Unger again. Trosson managed to grab Unger's helmet, pulling with all his strength, but the helmet slipped off in his hands. Desperately, he tried again but lost his footing, swept back down the chute once more. Realizing the severity of the situation, Hose and Strong removed their cave packs to lighten their load for another attempt. They climbed back up, fueled by desperation, but the powerful current pushed them back each time. Unger had been submerged for several minutes, and hopes of his survival dwindled rapidly. Exhausted and emotionally shattered, Hose and Strong clung to the rocks, staring at the chute where Unger had disappeared. At 2:45 p.m., the team made the heartbreaking decision to exit the cave, leaving Unger behind. Grief-stricken, they exited the cave in silence, the loss heavy in their hearts. 2 weeks later, with reduced water flow, a recovery team entered the cave to retrieve Unger's body. They found his body wedged beneath a boulder deep within the chute. It took considerable effort to free his body from the rocks. An autopsy revealed extensive head injuries, including skull and neck fractures, likely from the violent impact against cave walls. While drowning was considered, blunt force trauma was determined as the primary cause of death. Investigators noted that Unger's bulky boots with poor traction might have contributed to his initial slip. Analysis suggested that using a rope to secure his head above water could have increased his chances of survival. Unfortunately, the panic and chaos of the moment prevented such strategies from being employed. Alcove's pit tragedy. On September 5, 2013, Brett Smith and his friends set out for a day of hunting in the remote backwoods of New Mexico. The landscape was rugged and vast, with stretches of rocky terrain and scattered forests. Neither of them had caving experience or the proper equipment, but they carried only basic supplies and a utility rope. As they trekked, they spotted a jagged pit in the earth, nearly camouflaged by the rough terrain. Brett leaned over the edge, intrigued by the pit's depth and darkness. The hole, known locally as Alcove Pit, was notorious among experienced cavers for its deceptive shape and sharp drops. Despite the warnings, Brett saw it as a challenge rather than a hazard. He made the impulsive decision to descend, brushing off his friends' concerns. Using only their nylon emergency rope, Brett tied it to a nearby tree as an anchor. The rope wasn't designed for climbing, but they assumed it would hold just this once. Brett began his descent, the pit's walls narrowing faster than he expected. He braced himself against the rock, carefully maneuvering downwards. Sweat dripped as he twisted his body to avoid scraping against the jagged rock. Halfway down, the walls closed in sharply, forcing Brett into a tighter space. His foot slipped, sending loose rocks tumbling noisily to the bottom. The echo of the falling rocks sent a chill through him as reality sank in. He called up to his friend, saying he was coming back up, but panic crept into his voice. His fingers trembled as he gripped the rope, his arms burning with exhaustion. Above, his friend frantically searched for a way to help, pacing in distress. He decided to tie the rope to their ATV, hoping to pull Brett up with the vehicle's strength. As the ATV inched forward, Brett felt the rope strain unnaturally beneath him. He shouted to stop, sensing danger, but the rope was already at its limit. A loud snap filled the pit. The rope had given way. In an instant, Brett was in free fall, the rock walls rushing past him. He fell nearly 20 feet, slamming violently onto the jagged rocks below. A sickening thud echoed through the pit, followed by silence. His friend, John, stood frozen at the edge, staring into the abyss. For a moment, he couldn't tell if Brett was alive or dead. His hands shaking, John scrambled to call emergency services. Rescue teams arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting into the darkness. They called Brett's name, but there was no response, only an eerie silence. As they descended, hope faded with every passing minute minute of stillness. The first responders from James Canyon Rope Rescue reached the bottom. Brett was motionless, his body wedged between jagged rocks. His injuries were severe, a clear testament to the force of the fall. Despite efforts to revive him, it was clear Brett had not survived. John stood above, staring at the now slack rope, the realization of his friend's fate sinking in. Rescuers carefully prepared to lift Brett's body from the crevice. Using ropes and pulleys, they worked cautiously to avoid further complications. After hours of careful maneuvering, Brett's body was hoisted to the surface. The rescuers stood in silence, acknowledging the tragic outcome of the ordeal. By the time they emerged, the night was cold and heavy with grief.